Welcome to Philosophy 100, Consciousness. Our first topic is mind and matter. Let's start with mind. What are some of the things that minds do? Some beings with minds think, at least some of the time. So, for instance, right now you're probably thinking, hey, philosophy is pretty cool. And I agree. That we can think such thoughts, or any thoughts at all, is proof that we have minds. But maybe there are creatures that can't have thoughts, but still have minds. Say, chickens. Maybe chickens can't think. But of course they still have minds. That's because, among other things, they can experience sensations such as pain and pleasure. This distinguishes them from mindless things, such as trees and rocks. And perhaps chickens can also, like us, experience emotions such as happiness and sadness, though maybe they can't experience more sophisticated emotions, such as regret. Finally, it's pretty clear that chickens and humans alike can do those things we call seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and touching. In other words, we can all have what philosophers call perceptual experiences. Now, all of these things are part of what we call consciousness. Though it may be true, and we'll discuss this later, that we can have unconscious thoughts, sensations, emotions, and perceptual experiences, the fact is that, at least some of the time, our thoughts, sensations, emotions, and perceptual experiences are conscious. Now, what about matter? Well, your body is made of matter. And so, of course, are your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your nose, and your skin. In other words, your sense organs, which are pretty important for having perceptual experiences and sensations, are made of matter. Finally, most importantly, there is your brain. It makes up about 2% of your body weight, and it's pretty well established that without your brain, you don't have a mind at all. So, there's the mind, and more specifically, consciousness. And then there's the brain. And then there's the question, what exactly is the relationship between them? Are they the same thing? Are they different but somehow related? So go ahead, pause the video here and take a moment to think about this. Then write down your thoughts under question 1 on the accompanying assignment sheet. And whatever your answer, try to say something about why you think it is a good answer. But you don't need to write a whole book. A few sentences will do. When you're done, start the video again. So, again, we have consciousness, and we have the brain, and we have the question, what is the relationship between them? Now, and we will discuss this in much greater detail later on, what makes this a difficult question is that consciousness seems to be a very weird thing. We can see this by comparing it to an ordinary everyday object. Say, a fork. So let's compare a fork to the conscious experience of seeing a fork. Let's start with the fork. To begin with, forks are public objects in the sense that you and I can see and touch the very same fork. Moreover, they're shareable. You and I can have or possess the very same fork, even if this might make for difficult eating. And lastly, forks are objective in the sense that the existence of the fork does not depend on my mind, your mind, or any mind. If all minds went out of existence, the fork would still be there. Now, what about the conscious experience of seeing a fork? First, such experiences are private. You can't see or touch or directly observe my experiences of the fork. Second, my experience of seeing the fork is not something I can share with you. I can't hand it over to you in the way in which I can hand you the fork. Third, my experience of seeing the fork is subjective, in that its existence depends on the existence of my mind. More generally, if all minds go out of existence, so do all experiences. No minds, no consciousness of forks, or of anything else. And finally, and for many people this is the real biggie, my experience of seeing a fork has a certain feel. There's something it's like to see a fork. By contrast, there's nothing it's like to be a fork. Being a fork has no feel to it. More generally, it seems that there's nothing it's like to be a chunk of matter. So, if the physical world is made up of public, shareable, objective things with no feel, the question is, how can we fit consciousness into it? Now, please pause the video and answer question 2 on the accompanying assignment. Pick any object you can see and, in a few sentences, try to describe what it is like to see it. What does your visual experience feel like? This may be a difficult question to answer. If so, it's worth thinking about why. When you're done with question 2, restart the video. So, here's our question. What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? This is a big and difficult question, and there's no consensus among philosophers about how to answer it. There is, however, a consensus about what the main options are. First, there's monism, and second, there's dualism. Let's look at each of these more closely. Monism is the view that reality is fundamentally made up of one kind of stuff. There are two main types of monism. First, there is materialist monism, also called materialism or physicalism. According to this view, reality is fundamentally and entirely made up of matter. In other words, everything is through and through physical. Second, there is mentalist monism, more commonly called idealism. According to this view, reality is fundamentally made up of mental stuff. That is, reality is fundamentally mind. For pretty good reasons, idealism is not a popular view these days, and we won't talk much about it. Instead, our focus will be physicalism, which is a very popular outlook. The rise of physicalism is generally associated with the rise of modern science, and physicalism is often taken to be the only scientifically responsible view. However, it faces the apparently very serious problem of explaining how consciousness could be physical. For this reason, certain sophisticated forms of dualism remain popular among even scientifically informed philosophers. According to dualism, reality has two sides, the physical and the mental. There are two main ways to take this idea. First, there is substance dualism. According to substance dualism, reality is fundamentally made up of two kinds of stuff, physical stuff, or matter, and mental stuff, or mind. This view is famously associated with the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. Today, most philosophers reject substance dualism mainly because they think that the idea that there are non-physical minds is difficult to justify and creates at least as many philosophical problems as it solves. One of the main problems is the problem of interaction. How does non-physical mental stuff interact with physical stuff? This seems completely mysterious. So, most contemporary dualists are property dualists. According to property dualism, reality may be made up of matter, but, and this is a big but, matter can have special, mental, non-physical properties. Presumably, a lot of matter doesn't have such properties. Consider the fork, for instance. But perhaps if we arrange matter in the right sort of way, as in, say, the human brain, new, non-physical properties arise. The light of consciousness goes on. In sum, on the contemporary philosophical landscape, the contest between monism and dualism is mainly played out as a contest between physicalism or materialism and property dualism. So the philosophers that we will be studying in the coming weeks typically fall into one of these camps. First, there is Daniel Dennett, an arch-physicalist at Tufts University who has written a very long book entitled Consciousness Explained. Next, there is David Chalmers of Australian National University, perhaps the most prominent contemporary property dualist, who has written a very long book arguing that consciousness cannot be explained merely physically. Then we have Patricia Churchland of the University of California at San Diego, who has no patience for Chalmers' arguments and believes we should just do neuroscience. Fourth, we have Frank Jackson, also at Australian National University, who in 1982 published what is without question the most famous argument for property dualism in the modern era, the so-called knowledge argument. It's worth noting that Jackson has in recent years defected to physicalism, but for our purposes, we'll ignore that. Then lastly, there's Thomas Nagel, who in 1974 published a famous paper entitled What is it like to be a bat? And who, as we'll see, is hard to place on one side or the other. So these will be our main players. But before we look at their arguments, I want you to start by reflecting a bit on this yourself. Of the available options, physicalism, idealism, substance dualism, and property dualism, which do you prefer and why? Or perhaps after thinking about it a bit, you will find that you are undecided. If so, try to say something about why you remain undecided. Write down your thoughts under question 3 on the accompanying assignment. And keep in mind that there are no right or wrong answers here. You're now beginning to develop your own position in an ongoing debate. What counts is not the view that you choose, but how thoughtful you are in presenting your reasons for it. So, relax, have fun, and enjoy the process of developing your own position on these very challenging but fascinating issues.